So I'll do a limited amount of videos here. I'm going to concentrate more on my compositions, but I had told you guys that Pearl Harbor changed my father's course. He was studying at the Eastman School of Music at the time, and on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked America. And then on New Year's Eve, his father dropped dead of a heart attack. He was 60, my age. So why did the Japanese attack America? I mean, we're huge and they're small. Well, there are reasons for that. And you have to look back into history. You have to look at the Russo-Japanese War, where the Japanese had been very belligerent against a major power, Russia. And Russia negotiated a settlement, a peace. Same thing with China. China was far bigger than Japan in the 30s, and we all know about the rape of Nanking and the Manchurian aggressions and atrocities. And Japan figured they could do it to America, and so you have to look at the world in the late 30s and the early 40s. You had Churchill, and he was pushing for U.S. leadership in Europe to combat German aggression because, by May of 1940, Germany had basically conquered France, Denmark, the Low Countries, Belgium, so on and so forth, and they were preparing to, to literally do pretty bad things to London. In fact, you look at the Blitz, look at the bombings of London in 1940. I've been to the Strand where the Courtauld is right now and where King's College is. And I've been to areas where they still dig up bombs. I've been in Berlin with my friend Kier where there was an unexploded Allied bomb that was found. They evacuated our hotel. So there were Allied meetings that were taking place months before Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Navy was conducting all sorts of combat patrols, and they were actually sinking ships on the Atlantic War prior to Pearl Harbor. So Japan figured, the U.S. has most of their Navy in the Atlantic. They were correct. And after the war started, Franklin Delano Roosevelt developed a policy saying that there were two wars of equal footing. So what did the U.S. Military look like? Well, at the time of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army was the world's 19th largest. The Japanese was actually the largest numerically. The U.S. Army was the same size as the Mexican Army. True story. And even though the U.S. Navy had numerically the second largest fleet, as I said, 55% of them were in the Atlantic. And you start to look at the Japanese air fleets, and they were numerically superior to the U.S. by giant proportions. And they were on par with the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force of the UK, both in size and in quality. Japanese pilots were highly trained. They were probably the best skilled in actual combat because of their campaigns for the last 10 years before Pearl Harbor in China and in Manchuria. The Japanese were that good. And we had taken measures under FDR against the Japanese. We placed a limit on oil and steel and iron. And the one option that Hirohito and his generals saw was to seize their own source colony and expand the co-prosperity sphere and reach out to Germany, who they believed correctly would prefer to align with an Asian hegemony under Japanese leadership. And it had a lot to do with the oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber and metal from French Indochina mines. And so what they decided to do was to hit Pearl Harbor and hit the Philippines. My father saw action there. And so what they wanted to do was to basically sever that supply line, and that's what they almost did. You also have to look at the 1938 Two Ocean Naval Act by the U.S. Congress, which resulted in a huge order for aircraft carriers. I think there were 13 fleet carriers that were ordered, and that was gigantic. It was expanded 2 years later in 1940, which would have made the U.S. Navy the largest by 3 times as far as fleet carriers. And that would have been completed by 1942. So if you take a look at all the underpinnings and you forget the hidden history, which is what I talk about, then it just looks like Japanese were crazy, right? Most of the Japanese military leadership didn't have any understanding of capitalism or of the nature of the American people. However, they understood the jet stream before us. They literally sent balloons, first filled with explosives, and later they were going to be filled with anthrax and, other weapons of biological nature. One of the balloons, I think, killed a family of 5 in Bly, Oregon. You can look that up. But I think, Yamamoto was hoping that there would be some sort of settlement because he recognized that Japan could never win a prolonged war against the U.S. So, he figured a quick, hard strike, and then America would do what Russia and China did and enter into a face-saving peace. So I try to, how can I put this? Take a look at revisionist history and poke a hole in it. And there's a lot of revisionist history when it comes to Yamamoto and Hirohito and, Tora, a lot of the movies that were coming out. They're not very concise. They aren't. So that's that. There'll be more questions that will come up, and we can have fun with history and hopefully start to bust open the falsities of revisionist history, the history that we've been sold as a narrative, and a history that is at its root false.